In this lecture, we're going to talk about moss, which allows us to not look at soil. So it looks like there's been some stability for a period of time. And we'll talk about types of mosses, what to do, what mosses to avoid, where to find it, and its various utilities in bonsai, both in display and in everyday care. All right, so here we have several examples of mosses. We have different colors, we have different species that run around and species that jump up. For bonsai, in general, when it's in a ceramic container and when we have a flat surface, usually we want a moss that is a clumping type of moss, so not a runner. This is a runner. And the runner will charge across the soil and will go right up trunks. Whereas the clumping moss will kind of stay where it's put and tends to stay on the soil primarily. So there is, however, a use for these runner mosses. We have 3 of them here. And these 3 can be used for mounds, rock plantings, things like that. They help hold soil in place. And generally speaking, although these are pretty rambunctious and fat, for the most part they stay fairly close to whatever they're attached to. Whereas these, the only disadvantage of your upright growing mosses is that they develop quite a bit of height over a couple of years. And when that happens, you can take a scissors in the springtime and you can cut it off and it'll regrow. But these are the ones that we prefer for bonsai, and we'll talk a little bit about color next. Okay. So for now, let's concentrate on these, and I'll take these running mosses out of here. And we'll look a little more closely at these here. So these are all clumping mosses, and we have different kinds of color and texture. Some of these have quite a bit of texture. This is a moss that likes a lot of shade, so you want to be careful about using that one. In some situations it won't grow. Color is a big thing to keep in mind. Really bright ones have very limited use, although they can look very exciting. They can actually upstage a tree like this. In fact, the moss that is growing in the soil here is actually a little bit on the bright side, and a moss that has a little bit more red in it, like that one, would actually support the gray-green of the limber pine foliage quite a bit better. Right. So these are lichen, and lichen grow on the soil just like the moss does. It can also grow up on the trunk, and there's no problem having them there, especially on a pine or a spruce or a juniper, because they tend to grow in drier environments, whereas the moss you generally see in wetter environments. Over time, the lichen will outgrow the moss actually, even though it grows quite a bit slower, and you might end up having to peel some of it off, but you don't have to remove it. It's a very interesting organism. So while this might look like a plant, it's actually 2 organisms. There is a fungus that serves as a growing place for algae. And so it's quite unlike this, although it grows in the same environment. So let's talk next about where you find moss. I don't recommend finding it in dark forests, for instance, although you can find some very interesting and beautiful mosses there. They tend not to grow well on bonsai, which are often in the full sun. So find your moss in the full sun. You can find them between cracks in concrete. I used to collect moss from my rooftop. On the other hand, moss is very specific where it grows. So often moss that grows on a rock, a boulder or something like that, isn't going to be as happy on soil. So it does have to be a soil moss. Try and find a short nap moss, kind of like the ones that we have here, the ones that grow upright as opposed to the ones that run across the ground. And next I'd like to share how you establish the moss in the bonsai pot. Many of us live in more arid environments, and that can be a little bit tricky. So I have one little trick to share. If we want moss to establish as nicely as these have on this chochabai and on this limber pine, it helps to have a foundation on which the moss can get a footing. The soils that we use tend to dry out quite a bit at the surface. So one of the tricks is to use shredded up moss in order to get moss started. And that moss is a sphagnum moss. It's an orchid moss is another way that you might find that marketed. You can shred it up, and then you can add shredded up live moss to the sphagnum moss, and you put a thin layer of that on, and that will inoculate the live moss and allow it to grow. I would do this in your wettest season, whenever that is, if that's in the winter, or many people do it just right at repotting time. This pine here was just repotted, and within a year we're going to have maybe not quite this much moss, but a fair bit of moss growing on top of the surface of the soil. So if you were to put a tree in a show and you wanted moss on there and it didn't have it, you could certainly take some of the moss over there, and you could cut away the bottom of it and place little pads of it on there, and that's a very common way to show your plant. This creates the possibility of having year-round moss, which gives us several benefits. For one thing, it insulates the plant from heat and from frosts on the surface even. Also, there's a very easy read of the moisture content in your soil, because the little rootlets of the moss grow down into the soil by about a ½ an inch. So when that moss is bright and hydrated, so is the soil underneath. It's also hydrated. If it's shriveled, you can be sure that that top inch doesn't have a lot of water in it, and you probably want to water your plants. So moss is a good indicator. It's like a litmus test as to the moisture in the pot, and that's one reason that we want it on year-round, not just for show. So there's also some differences according to deciduous versus conifer. Usually your moss isn't going to grow as vigorously on a pot that a conifer is in, because we don't water it quite the same way that we water deciduous trees, which is a little bit more. So we often have more lush moss growth on the deciduous tree, and perhaps a little bit more lichen growth on the pine and the juniper. And that tends to make sense, because the lichens tend to grow in more arid environments and you see less moss there. Even if you have a year-round moss cover and you want to put this tree in a show, you probably still have a few areas that you're going to have to add moss to cover it. And one of the joys of mossing a tree for a show is that you can really compose. You can use different kinds of moss. You can use moss in combination with lichen. And it can be part of the visual tapestry that ends up becoming the tree on display versus the tree in jeans. Here's an area that if we were to put this into a show, we'd probably want a little bit of moss right in here. And we put a little bit of sphagnum down, like is on this tree here. We put some of that down first, and then we can start organizing our moss to go on top of that. Trimming off the bottom. The more flat you make this, the better the contact will be, and probably the longer it'll last. So I'm just going to put this around, not putting it on the live moss that's already there. So regardless how you do this, you're probably going to create some hills and valleys and whatnot. And I tend not to exaggerate that too much, but that's personal preference. You can definitely do that. Here's another type of moss that might be fun to throw in there. It's a bit more gray-green, like our needle is. And then the lichen can go a little closer to the There we go. Particularly on a pine, after the show, This moss tends to be difficult to keep going because we don't tend to overwater our pines. They don't seem to like that, but the moss seems to like a lot of moisture.